Hi guys, it's Andy McDonald, physio and strength and conditioning coach, and welcome to the Informed Performance podcast. On today's episode, Ben Ashworth will be speaking to physio Laura Penhall, who's also impressively a double world record holder, a performance manager, and a consultant for expeditions or world record attempts. This episode has been sponsored by Vol Performance, makers of ForceDecks, the world's fastest, easiest, and most powerful dual force plate system. ForceDecks can help you to analyse neuromuscular strength, performance and imbalances in your athletes. With an incredibly simple setup and intuitive software, ForceDecks automatically detects over 15 common force plate tests and analyses them with a single click, helping you to collect quick and accurate insights on your athletes. To learn more, head over to our sponsor, volperformance.com. You're listening to the Informed Performance podcast. I'll switch over to Ben now for his conversation with Laura Penhall.
So welcome to another episode of the Informed Performance. I'm Ben Ashworth, and today on the show we've got Laura Penhall, who I've known since around 2003, I think, when Laura and I were working for the same rugby club, doing some work together right back in the day. And Laura actually is a physiotherapist by trade. She's worked with Paralympic and Olympic sports at Winter and Summer Games. She's worked in tennis, she's worked in sailing and cycling. She's a world record holder twice over and a world first record holder. And we'll find a bit more about that as we ask her about her journey in a second. But firstly, Laura, really great to be able to catch up with you today, and welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. And yeah, crikey, 2003. Is that how long ago it was? That's scary, isn't it? But yeah, the old days. It's great to catch up.
Yeah, it's great to have you on. So just for the benefit of the listeners, if you can speak about your journey, which is a very interesting journey and very different to the kind of traditional physio route, I would say. If you can speak a bit about your journey up to this point, just to give the listeners a bit of background.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's a really good way of describing it and introducing it. It is slightly unconventional, I guess. I did start out, obviously, as everybody else, with doing the sort of the undergraduate sort of physio degree and then starting to specialise a bit more in sport. But I guess fundamentally throughout the whole theme of it, I've always been a physio that has wanted to really understand any patient, any athlete that I've ever worked with, more than just the injury. So if somebody came in with a twisted ankle, I've always wanted to see them as the person, and understand the environment and the context that they're in. So kind of, working with, say, marathon runners, I kind of wanted to then run a few marathons to figure out what it felt like, what they were going through. So to give me more context. When I was working with a skier, I then decided to go and do a ski season because I wanted to, again, learn to ski. And it is partly because I love being outdoors, and I've got an interest in sort of being a bit of a jack of all trades, master of none in a sporting context personally. But it also just, I feel, just gave me more to build the rapport with anybody that I was working with, and to add a bit more value than just the sort of, not just that's demeaning what we do, but I just find kind of our hands-on skills can be even more powerful if we're listening and we've got a connection with the patient and the athlete. So that my journey really started off NHS with, as most of us, doing the rotations. And then I went off and did a ski season, and then started working with the GB ski team quite quickly after actually just picking up the phone to Mark Tilston at the time. He was the head coach for the British ski team, and just saying, could I just come along and observe as like a proper keen bean 3 years out from qualifying. And to be fair, Ben, that was most probably what I did with you, wasn't it? With Boss Academy or whatever it was back then, picking up the phone and being a bit of a keen bean. But yeah, so I started to, and I turned up with Mark, where I turned up, at skiing, and it was in Val d'Isere, and I thought I was just there to observe. And the coach turns around to me, he's like, yeah, so we've got the men's downhill, and actually the physio's not here. I figured you could do it. Are you all right with that? I was like, yeah, sure. Okay. I was like, okay, I'm just going to be treating them in the hotel or whatever. It'll be fine. It's no different. He's like, great. Well, if you can go up on the hill with them 6 a.m. in the morning, do their warm up, and we'll get cracking like that. And now let's put this in context. I'd only just learnt to ski about 2 months before, and now suddenly I'm standing at the top of a black, icy downhill at Val d'Isere, bricking myself at the fact that I now have to ski down this damn thing and look cool and have all the kit. So yeah, but do you know what? That sets the scene, because I guess with any sport that I've worked in, I've not necessarily known the context and the environment or the sport itself, but it's the best way to learn is to literally get thrown in the deep end. And that opened the doors. It was thanks to Tilston, sort of, I was working with Shemi and a few of the other men's downhill team from the Aussies, and ended up touring and doing a few bits with them, which just opened the doors into sport, really. And from that, then I worked with the Paralympic ski team, and went to Vancouver Games with them. And the reason for that was because we had a pretty successful team, and also, they didn't have any major support at the time. So I was really, really always intrigued with Paralympic sport, because I love the individual. I love the fact of what they've overcome with the significant adversity that has been thrown at them. And, it's about optimizing what their abilities are. And that really sort of connects with me. So I then went into Paralympic sport, and that followed through to Paralympics GB for 2012, and then into British Athletics. I became the head physio for the Paralympic British Athletics team through to 2016. And during that time, that was also when I then stepped away personally, and alongside working, had come across sort of an opportunity for myself to explore and go into ocean rowing, which I'm sure we'll touch on in a little bit. But basically, as I said before, I like to understand the athletes and the people I work with. And when I went into Paralympic sport, my biggest thing was that, if it's a marathon runner, if it's working with a skier, I can go and try that sport out. And I won't be an Olympic medalist at it, but I can just get the context and the environment. Whereas with Paralympics, you can't replicate having to go through significant adversity that they've gone through. And it just fascinated me to sort of understand, what do people draw on when they're faced with wanting to give up and then not give up, and then strive to sort of want to get the most out of life. And I know that's a bit deep and philosophical, but it really was the sort of question I keep asking myself of why do we wait for adversity to be thrown at us? Why is it that, we have to have a major curveball to then want to make the most out of every, what abilities we do have. So it kind of was making me push myself to do different things. And that's what entered me into more of the world of expedition and extreme medicine type stuff, because, doing the triathlons, half Ironman stuff I was doing at the time, it just wasn't really pushing the boundaries for me in that context. And I wanted to do something that was out of my comfort zone completely, totally unknown to me, and was going to be somewhere that I'd most probably want to give up, but I couldn't, and wanted to know what it was that I was going to draw on during those times. And that's when, I was looking for something significant and found out about ocean rowing. And that ocean rowing journey evolved into what was supposed to be a small 1 month journey, soon became a much bigger one, which was the Pacific. So that's then what you alluded to, Ben, at the start was, we can go into that in a bit more detail, but we then set out in 2015, and as a team, as a crew of 6, and a team of 4 on the boat any one time. And we set from San Francisco in 2015 and finished in Cairns, Australia in 2016. I had 9 months at sea, 253 days at sea. But through doing that, we were the first ever all 4 female crew and all 4 crew ever to row from mainland America to mainland Australia, via rowing only. So that was it was a great personal achievement, for sure, just to sort of show what you actually can achieve when you're really focused and you've got a really strong belief in what you're doing and a real strong purpose. But I did it more because I wanted to understand the athletes. I wanted to understand what you need to draw on to achieve your goals. And that was one of the biggest drivers for doing the row, and it was one of the biggest learnings for me as well, to carry forwards and then therefore support my athletes with a bit more depth, in kind of seeing them as the human being in front of me, and making sure they're getting what they want out of the sport, the context, and really owning it, I guess. And then sort of off the back of doing the row, went into Rio 2016, finished Rio 2016, stepped out of the sort of Olympic sports circle, and started working with Naomi Osaka for a year on the tennis circuit. And alongside that had committed to supporting Mark Beaumont on an expedition, which was cycling around the world in under 80 days, which basically combined my passion of bringing performance, which I'd been working in for sort of the previous kind of 10 to 12 years, and bringing that to somebody who'd never thought really about performance. You know, Mark Beaumont is your classic of, he's cycled around the world before. He cycled the length of Africa and set the world record there. He cycled the length of America. The guy he's an absolute machine. He's done a huge amount, but has never ever had any sort of physiological testing, training. He doesn't even look at his bike setup, you know, likes to do 80 days. I mean, he could have changed his saddle. He could have changed his saddle height, and he wouldn't bat an eyelid. You know, he would jump on any bike and not think about it. So to get him into getting sort of some basic measures and testing in place, and to set him up and to just get him to hydrate and to fuel better when he's on the bike, I was really intrigued to see actually what performance could we get out of this person, given the sort of achievements he's had to date. If we just add some basic foundational work around him, what could he achieve? And that was phenomenal to be part of that, to both help to prepare him and then support him on the around the world, which he achieved, and achieved it in under 80 days, which was a phenomenal achievement in itself. And then off the back of that, I kind of came back into the world of Olympic sport, and up until October last year, I was head physio with British Sailing, and then had the tough decision at that point of, actually, I don't think my head's in that sort of conformed elite sport physio space anymore. And actually, now need to sort of continue on my own journey in more performance management in different spheres. And so that's what I did in October when the games got postponed. And that's where I'm at now, with working with an eclectic portfolio mix of different athletes, expeditions, and other environments as well.
I think the word "wow" comes to mind.
I was going to say, that's a bit long-winded, wasn't it? Sorry, I got on a rant.
No. I hope that the people listening to this are doing what I'm doing, which is just to be astonished at the journey. And you know, I deliberately, when I had a look sort of at your background, I deliberately tried to look at a few things, but I don't think anything can really get across that ocean. That ocean sort of experience, and in fact, I did come across one thing that you'd started and you got 500 miles or something, and then you had to go back to the start again, which was, an absolute shocker, and certainly a test, at that point.
Yeah, do you know what though? There's so many learnings from the row, and it's helped me no end in kind of how I support athletes going forwards, because there were so many different setbacks, but there was also so many parallels to what our athletes experience. So, you know, it took me 4 years to get to start line. And even then, that wasn't the plan. It wasn't the plan to be 4 years. The plan was for it to be a year and then go. And of course, you know, we were underprepared, didn't have actually the proper team together, didn't have the finance, all of that stuff. So then it was like, right, wake up call. Okay, we'll go next year. Then things still weren't quite right. And it was like, right, do you give up? Or, you know, if you've got and the thing was, I had such a strong passion and a vision. And I just knew that there was going to be a team of all 4 women that one day in my lifetime were going to row the Pacific. And it was cheesing me off that I couldn't set that up. So it was like, right, well, it's like we do, it's just an analysing, reviewing, reflecting on, okay, well, what's not working and why is it not working? What other things can I try? And who can I speak to? What expertise can I put around me to get the best out of me, in essence, and, you know, not expect myself to know everything, and especially in that world, which was completely unknown to me. And it was great because being a blank canvas, having never rowed before, have never sort of lost sight of shore, not done any sailing stuff in the past, everything was brand spanking new. And you know, I'm pretty sure, well, I know that you've interviewed Wolfie, Alex Wolf, on this podcast before, and he's a good friend. And Wolfie was one of the first people I picked up the phone to when I decided to row an ocean. I was like, mate, this is what I'm going to do. And his usual response, as with most people's, was like, well, you're just nuts. That's ridiculous. You've never sat in a rowing boat before. Why would you suddenly row the Pacific? You know, you could just try the Channel if you really want a challenge. And I kind of was like, yeah, but I just think it's doable, and I want to see how far I can get if I surround myself with the best experts. So he was the first person I picked up the phone to. He was head S&C coach at GB Rowing at the time. And so who better to speak to say, right, how can I get myself big enough, robust enough, and conditioned well enough to withstand repetitive rowing for months at a time? And yeah, so he helped get me on track with significant, should I say, weight gain, going from like a 58 kilo marathon runner to a 72 kilo rower, which he took great delight in, by the way. You know, we'd go for dinner and he'd be the one making me chomp on a 24-ounce steak and God knows what else, and taking great glee in it. So it was highlighting to me kind of, as much as sometimes we can be the expert that we sort of input into an athlete, but it's, you know, I think there's great, I've always learned a lot from surrounding myself with experts so that I can deliver the best care to the people that I'm working with. And the row really sort of embodied that. I think also the other learning from, well, there's loads, but the biggest parallels I would say to sport context as well was that, you know, it was 4 years to the start line, and how many athletes do we have that get injured or other circumstances that get taken out of their control to a certain extent, which means, you know, they miss a significant time scale. It might be they miss a Europeans or a world champs, and suddenly that, you know, vision of being selected to go to the Olympics feels like it's drifting further and further away. Whereas if you can keep that engagement and you can sort of keep that fire in the belly through different ways and means of tapping into what their purpose and their beliefs are, it's really, really powerful. And that was the parallel I had for that 4-year cycle. And then, you know, out at sea, it was getting the job done. It was sort of the focus that you need, and sort of just breaking stuff down into bite-sized chunks of literally stroke by stroke, shift by shift, 2 hours on, 2 hours off for 24/7, day by day, leg by leg. And then eventually suddenly you're there in Australia, which, you know, 5 years later, practically.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of learnings for you personally, which is great. And you're actually translating those learnings now into sort of corporate spaces as well, aren't you? You're doing some work outside of the world of sport.
Yeah, it's been really interesting, sort of, because when doing that stuff, and that isn't why I did it at all. As I said, it's very much been about how to support the people I work with on the clinical front. But having done that, and, you know, and it brought some media exposure. We had a documentary that was made from it, which was on Netflix. We were really fortunate with all that stuff. But that has led to kind of highlighting, that corporates have come forwards in different shapes and forms for me to talk about the leadership style that I had and how I pulled the team together, and the sort of the difficulties we faced. And to me, like, it doesn't interest me, to be perfectly honest, to just talk about the row and talk about the journey. It's got to have application. And I just see that there's so many parallels in the struggles that we face in a day-to-day life, whether that's in sport, whether that's, you know, COVID, you know, that we've all been going through lately. The classics, that there's certain human behaviors that we all face. And that the point is, and why I love expedition and the extreme medicine stuff, is it strips away all the noise. like totally. And it takes you back to proper raw basics of survival and what you really need to focus on. And the day-to-day life that we live in now is just so comfortable. We've got everything at our fingertips that we sort of sometimes forget what's actually necessary and what sort of, what we can control. That is the simplistic part of life. And that's, I think Expeditions Extreme Medicine just can strip back that and show you the power of simplicity, and then what you can achieve by just doing the basics and doing them well.
Yeah, definitely. Something that I think, from my own personal perspective, you're sometimes very blessed working in a world of elite sport with a lot of technologies at your fingertips and perhaps more than you actually need. So yeah, stripping it back to keeping it simple is something that I try and do, but hearing it in the context of that kind of extreme world that you've been working in it brings it a bit more to light for me as well. I think sort of just to now sort of segue a little bit into, or at least pick up some of the stuff you've been talking about. You've worked in a number of different sports, and obviously within these different sports, you're trying to understand the sports specifics. You're trying to understand what the program might look like, what preparation looks like for each different athlete in those different sports. But where you've come to, I know you're kind of taking a more sort of human-centered performance approach, and I just wanted to sort of open it up to you to discuss what that means to you, and to give the listeners a little bit of your sort of opinion, your bias and your kind of experiences, if you like, on your focus when you're working with athletes and teams.
Yeah, no, and it's a great question. I mean, first and foremost, diversity within a team, I think, is really powerful and really important. So having people that are clinical specialists and really good deep domain expertise, I think, is extremely important. I guess, I've always sat more in the generalist, rather than or maybe a specialist at being a generalist, if you get me.
Yeah.
Because, I'd like to think I can assess reasonably sort of well to a good standard. But to me, then you've got people like yourself, Ben, that, I would pick up the phone to or reach out to. You're a shoulder specialist. You've got some great insight and experience there. So therefore I could spend days, weeks going down a path, or I can pick up the phone to you to get your specialist opinion and maybe be a bit more specific in what my approach and application can be, or bring you in or get that athlete to come and see you to assess and diagnose. So, I just want to optimize what it is for the athlete. And sometimes I've felt like, I don't know, in the sort of the journey that I've had, and that's potentially, it's a big reason why I sort of stepped out, because I felt like I was needing to conform in what a very clinical sort of physio approach should be. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. I just started to recognize that wasn't, I was really moving towards more wanting to, seeing the holistic of a patient and an athlete. And therefore sometimes recognizing that physio was just not well placed at that time. It might be actually working with a psychologist. It might be removing them from the sport altogether, because I could see that, the fire in their belly is gone and they don't, they've lost a sense of identity or, and to me, I then end up having quite strong empathy with my athletes to sort of go, actually, I think what's best for you right now is speaking to this person over here, or dealing with, directing them elsewhere. So I guess my practice has evolved over time to recognizing the strengths that people that I've worked with brings through different specialties, and, drawing on that, not feeling like I've got to own everything and be the key deliverer. If I want the best for the athlete, then I want them to see the best. So, and that isn't necessarily me. And that could well be, like I say, it might not be physio that's the strand or deep domain expertise that's required at that point. It might be better for them to spend some time with the physiologist or nutritionist or psychologist or whoever within our team, rather than so many voices sometimes going into an athlete. And so I guess I've started to evolve more into wanting to go shoulder to shoulder with an athlete or a team to recognize, have a fairly good understanding and a recognition of identifying what they might need and then pulling the right experts in to deliver that in the most efficient and effective way. And I guess a good sort of example of that would be, there's a female player, tennis player that, so there's a couple that I look after, but one in particular, and there was a longevity of kind of injury history and sort of a not great sort of female health background when they were younger, from the age of like 16 to 20 being amenorrheic and then, thankfully go into a new team and them sort of wrapping them around. But they've had historically sort of episodic injuries that just people couldn't quite put their finger on. By going in and shoulder to shoulder with that person, understanding what their needs and wants are, and then so seeing them first as the human and first what their beliefs, feelings are, and listening to them is crucial. And then from that, speaking to the team that are currently wrapped around them, and then identifying, okay, who would be like, where's the best? What's our biggest bang for our buck that we're going to be able to make a shift on here, and what does the athlete think on that front? So to me, the athlete themselves has to own it, that they've got to be part of the process. And through my journey, I've done it myself, I've definitely fallen short with athletes before, where I would say I've most probably made decisions and not articulated it well with the athlete, or made decisions for them rather than actually with them. And it sounds subtle, but I think it's something that's crucial. And I've become more sensitive to it over the years latterly, because I think we can, as sports scientists, as a whole cohort of us, we can think we see what is the biggest thing that they need to do, but they're at the center, and we really do have to get them on board. And if they're not on board and they're thinking that they need to be working on something else, and you're saying, no, you need to work on your physiology, when really their psychology is not in a good state, and if their focus and their belief isn't where you want it to be, the adherence isn't going to be there, and the belief isn't going to be there, so therefore your effectiveness isn't going to be anywhere near where you want it to be. So sometimes I think you've got to compromise where the main focus might be in order to get them on board and get the adherence in the first state. And secondly to that, there's a big power, I think personally, and this is just my opinion, in an athlete just owning it, like, and really believing and owning what their pathway of treatment and rehab is. And so them having some active choices in the process, and when they're getting time off, and just being involved in that and asking for their opinions and helping to guide athletes versus tell. And again, don't get me wrong, I've spent years in a tell space, and there's certain people I've worked with, and I would say actually Paul Mullen, who was he was head of sports science and medicine at British Sailing, he did this brilliantly and really highlighted this to me, just the art of questioning, right? Where just, how do you question to just get somebody to think slightly differently, and how we can use that art of questioning with the athletes and the people that we work with, just to get them on board to think in to challenge our thinking, both for ourselves and for somebody else, without always being in a tell space when we think we know what's going on based on limited information that we might have. And so I suppose again, it's going off a bit deep, but to me, I like to build a rapport with an athlete. I like them to be part of it. I want to feel like I'm in a team with them, and that they're sharing sort of the ownership on the decisions that we're making. Because in my experience, if they don't, then we're also giving them a bit of an out and a bit of a sort of a, what's the word, like an external sort of reason if something doesn't go so well. And what I mean by that is, a classic example, or maybe a good example, would be previously in a sport, there was a pairs team, and they got selected to go to the games. And in their voice, whether this was rightly or wrongly, and if this did happen or not, I don't know, but in their opinion, when they got selected, they suddenly were bombarded with sports science support around them, everybody trying to optimize this, that, and the other, and pulling them in this direction, that direction. Obviously, everybody in that sports science team was doing it for thinking that they're going to get the best performance out of this pair. But when it came to the games, this pair would say that they felt pretty overwhelmed and actually felt like that was what took them off their game. And so then they weren't successful at the games, and they thought they would be more so. So in the next cycle, they stepped completely away from the program and only engaged with sort of the things and the people on their own terms, which, to be honest, I massively respected. And I was like, you know what? Yes, you might be trying to train right now with a horrendous elbow tendinopathy that is not, not getting better by doing what you're doing. But I've given them the advice, and that, they know the decisions that they're making, and they've got to own that. So, and I think that's something that we can overlook. And I've certainly overlooked in the past. I've definitely fallen short of that. And only latterly would I say have I really recognised the value of an athlete owning their pathway, and then therefore, allowing them to fail to a certain extent, as long as you're acting in best practice, or sharing the right information. So they've got informed consent and all of that stuff. But yeah, I think them owning the decision so that they can learn from failures as well as successes, is important.
Yeah, that actually, that really resonates with me too. This kind of empowering the athlete. We've had a chat before about this, and that's certainly one of the words that you've used when we've spoken before. Empowering the athlete to make their own decisions, to own their own decisions. I remember one of the players that I worked with at one point, who'd had a pretty checkered injury history in recent times, and he bounced off a few other people and was seen as one of those awkward players who, nothing's going to make him better. And we met, I think we had a sort of appointment time, and he said, right, and he jumped on the couch. He said, no, put your shoes on. We're going for a walk. And he sort of looked at me like I'm crazy. And we walked round the grounds of the place I was working at the time. And it was a 45-minute consult, essentially. But I was just asking him what had worked for him, what hadn't worked for him, trying to understand, because I was trying to, maybe use the benefit of his experiences, of his own opinion. And he's a human, and I knew the people who'd worked with him were good practitioners, but whatever was being done wasn't helping this individual. So it was trying to tap into a different angle with him. And, you sometimes, if you come in like that as a last resort, you often go to that point where you have to go down and sort of try and understand more about why things haven't worked. But perhaps we should be doing that up front more. And I'm certainly guilty of that in my career, for sure.
Yeah. Well, it is funny. I mean, that's a really good example of you getting something to put the shoes on, going for a walk, and not jumping on the bed. And actually, at British Sailing, Lily Devine, who is the head physio now, performance support at Sailing, I stepped into her role for maternity leave to start with, and then continued when she went into performance support role. And she'd set up that same process of, like, there was a chair by the door there, and they had to come in and sit down on the chair, not go to the bed. And it's really interesting, though, that kind of, it is funny, and this comes down to our own personas and self-awareness of how we operate as clinicians, because when I reverted back into that environment, I suddenly went back into a bit of a clinical mode and just a bit of a routine and a process. Whereas out of there, and I suppose because I felt like there was expectation, which is only, my perception of what I'm putting on myself, not actually what was going on or what was there. But out of that context, I do exactly what you were saying, Ben, of, I'd sit and have a chat, go for a walk, have a coffee, just get the full picture, if I was working independently. But as soon as I went into a clinical room, I pretty much would act like an athlete, of being like, right, yeah, okay, this is the process, and going into a bit of an automatic, right, they come in, get on the bed, have a chat. But actually what was great there is that changed that, and sort of Lily had recognised that as well, which is, it's really good. But sometimes that can work both ways, with athletes and us as therapists. We've got to recognise when we're just going into habitual format versus, mixing it up a little bit to get more out of both of us.
Yeah, and it's easy enough, I suppose, to spend time when you've got time. So if you're working with an individual athlete, you can go for a walk, you can then have a session, you can go for a coffee, you can do all those sorts of things, and perhaps even with smaller athlete groups. But when it comes to the larger athlete groups, going back to what you were saying before, it lends itself more to this empowerment so that you don't create that kind of dependency on you. As a physio.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And and that's something, being able to keep that lens, that zooming out and zooming in sort of respect, especially in the elite sport, when you've got a program that might be 62 athletes, and then you've suddenly got a selected group that are about 12, 15 that are going to the games that are the high priorities. That having that strategic approach to be able to zoom out and zoom back in again. I've got to be honest, in the latter stages, I struggled with that because I was always fighting with the sort of the time frame, the restrictions, and coordinating everything. But that is exactly what I was going after, was that for outside of the sort of podium guys, then you still want to make sure the right care and delivery is provided to those that are the developing athletes and those that are the potential athletes that will be going to 2024. So as part of that process, my strategy was more about, well, how do we create more empowerment in this cohort of athletes? Because to me, what would be success is one of those athletes walking into the clinic room or picking up the phone to me and saying, right, I twisted my ankle doing this. I've now iced it. I've elevated it. I've strapped it. I've done X, Y, and Z. I totally get that I've twisted it, but I need your advice on, actually, what have I done? And you're like, right, great. Actually, they've done all that initial good self-management plan, and they're now coming to us for the specifics and what we're there for, versus being there all the time to do all the strapping up and the icing and the booting and the crutches and stuff when it's 2-3 days down the line, and you're like, damn it, if this was only done on day one and I knew about it on day one, it would have been a lot better. So if we can inform the athletes to then self-manage better, we're just improving that recovery timeline, aren't we? And hopefully focusing on the clinical skill sets a bit more that we've got than the stuff that's straightforward.
Yeah, I think that's a challenge that, if you've worked in Olympic sport and you worked with a larger cohort of athletes, or, any sport that's, you've got to juggle a large number of players or athletes. It is about scaling it, isn't it? It's about making it scalable. It's about prioritizing. It's a coordination and logistical challenge as much as it is a sort of clinical challenge at times. I want to. Sorry, go ahead.
No. Well, no. The only thing I was going to say as well, what's kind of, I think we've all got a similar view on that, right? That kind of the ideal is sort of athlete empowerment, and they're coming to us, but that also takes, in the younger sort of the youth, the juniors and stuff, if they've not had an injury or illness in our sort of field, then sometimes it takes for them to have an injury or an illness for them to recognize the impact it has and to know the strategies. But without that, then it's how do you create that behavior change? How do you create that empowerment when they don't see the value in that sort of space? And that fascinates me of what you tap into, whether it's the role models and other people that aren't ourselves that sound like we're being sort of teachers about it, like our approach, and getting them on board, getting them to design their own programs to a certain extent for prevention stuff, to create longer standing behavior change. And again, for them to own it, I think is a fascinating space to see when it's done well.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I want to go back to a little bit more kind of specifics. And in particular, you mentioned some stuff there around a female athlete, and it's a space that I'm certainly no expert in and would reach out to an expert to deal with. But you've had certainly a decent amount of experience now in the management of kind of the female athlete, and I just wondered if you can talk to us a little bit about some of the key things that you might do differently when managing female athletes, or certainly some of the things that you would look for in the management of female athletes.
Yeah, I think I think fundamentally there's, well, female or male, there's certain things, but we've maybe been, and this isn't a feminist approach, and it's always what I've got to be, I always get, I suppose, defensive about, it's just recognizing the individual that's in front of you. And I guess historically, and it's only been latterly that I've really started to understand the female athlete, even though I'm a female and I suppose doing the row stuff. But there were certain choices that I made personally, with decisions I made to optimize my personal performance because I had some scientific knowledge and understanding. And it wasn't until I was going through some stuff that I was like, actually, yeah, how specific are we when we treat and assess our female athletes? And that was supported as well by, alongside that, there was Emma Ross is a brilliant physiologist that was the head physiologist at the English Institute of Sport, and she's set up the Smart Her project, which was just started with creating discussions around how specific are we being with the female athletes, what do we know, and are we asking the questions, and long story short, a lot of the things that have come out is, the application, whether it's training, whether it's load, whether it's physiology sort of assumptions that we've made, are based around the physiology of a male athlete. And actually, we've not been able to monitor the influence of the female hormones as much, and the same in the medicine world, because they're different from female to female, month to month, let alone between females. So therefore it's difficult to get scientific clinical studies in place. And so then it's not necessarily been done. And so, long story sort of short, I suppose, long way round to saying it, latterly I've just really recognised, thankfully, having worked with Emma and Dr. Rich Burden as well, who's head of biosciences, it's just highlighting to me the importance of kind of the hormonal system and the menstrual cycle. And it's not just that, though, that's only a very small part of it, but there's been plenty of times historically where I've seen on a note system that a female athlete has got amenorrhea, for instance, lack of periods, and that gets palmed off then to the chief medical officer, the doc, and then often the doc would then forward that person to a gynecologist or, to make sure that there's not anything that's underlying. Or if somebody's got sort of really painful periods, they get straight away sent off to a gynecologist and made sure there's nothing major that's underlying. And often they come back and no, there isn't anything significant to be aware of. So, but then it seems to be, well, then, so what? What happens then? And there isn't a huge amount that's historically been done. And actually, there's so much stuff of the link of the pelvic floor and the influence that has to female performance, the presentation, it provides. What we, is not commonly talked about is that the young females, there's a lot that might have stress incontinence, which is crazy. You'd think that would only happen in postnatal women that have given birth and stuff, where their pelvic floor has been affected. But actually we're seeing it more and more in the young females, and especially the young females that are in sports such as tennis and other sports like that. We've got rapid change of direction, torsion that's going across the pelvis, and the loads that they need to tolerate. And it actually, the pelvic floor specialists or pelvic specialist physios will say that there's we talk about the pelvic floor needing to be tense, to do exercises. And actually it's the opposite. Sometimes it's trying to assess and diagnose whether in the younger athletes they're over tense, and all the abdominal loading that we do and the sling work that we do, time under tension and trying to get sort of, trunk stiffness and pillar stiffness is all great to a certain extent. But through that we create a lot of bracing. And if females don't have that awareness across their pelvic floor and the interaction with the diaphragm and how they breathe, then you could be overstressing that pelvic floor. They could be over tense. And then as soon as they need to do a bit of a wide step or a sudden change of direction, they get pressure onto their bladder and they get a sense of urgency or a sense of leaking. And that's that's not okay, but they don't necessarily talk about it. And also, we don't necessarily ask the question. It wasn't something I was aware of until about five or 6 years ago, when I was working with a player, and it suddenly highlights to me that there's certain things that we don't necessarily tap into. With the pelvic floor, that also, if an athlete is over tense, there's also, as long as that's diagnosed well, there's ways to then get it to relax. There could be over scarring sometimes as well. But there's a whole host of things that could be happening that can be well treated if it's caught, in good time when they're young. But it can become a real problem as they get older. Secondly, if somebody does have an overtight pelvic floor, it can present with constipation and GI sort of difficulties. They also, if they're over tense in their pelvic floor, there's potential discussion around, does that cause overstress in the abdominals? So repeated rectus abdominis tears or adductor tears. Often we would also highlight the fact that they may not have the strength in those areas, so they're trying to use other places to fix. So there's that whole system in itself. And then when we go back to sort of the hormonal cycle stuff, is how that interacts as well with, if they're not getting a natural cycle. So if an athlete is amenorrheic, as I sort of started this conversation with, and there's not a major medical concern like polycystic ovaries or anything like that needs a medical intervention, then we also know, and this is fairly common now, isn't it, we used to call it the female triad, but it's not just specific to females, but we recognize it in females with the loss of period, because if females aren't fueling enough, then that RED-S, relative energy deficit syndrome stuff, is really relevant to the fact that when it becomes significant, first thing that goes in our system is periods, is a menstrual cycle. And that's our body's way of shutting down and protecting ourselves, because we just don't have the energy to go through the cycle, which is pretty powerful. If we think about how many athletes I've seen on medical notes with amenorrhea in the lifetime of, my career lifetime, there's actually quite a few, which is shocking, to be honest. And I think for sure we've now got obviously great nutritionists and physiologists that are involved to correct that now and do proper energy utilization assessments, energy expenditure assessments, and making sure that, the athletes are fueling well, whether that's male or female, which is crucial. But the impact that has on their hormonal cycles is what's been an eye-opener to me, is that even when they do get the nutrition back on track and you start to see them having periods, I've made the assumption in the past that, okay, that's fine, they're good, we've done the right intervention there, we're back on track, great, then nothing more needs to be done. But latest stuff that's been happening with a company called Mint Diagnostics, Hormonics, that Rich Burden has brought into the Institute of Sport to validate and sort of get some volume through. The fascinating thing that I've been using this with a particular female athlete that I'm working with, we've tracked her cycle, getting her to do daily reporting on all of her symptoms for the past 18 months. And then we started doing hormonal tracking with Mint Diagnostics for the past 4 or 5 months. And that's like saliva sampling and we get the sort of results at the end of the month. And that shows levels of estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, and in the future it'll do cortisol and stuff as well. But certainly tracking with her estrogen and progesterone. Now, her cycle she had a return cycle, which is great, but it wasn't necessarily that frequent. And it was starting to be sort of a little bit outside the normal 28 to 35 days. And she would still have blocks of even up to 60 days without a period at times. But if you looked at her diet, you would say, well, she's fueling at the right time around sport and she seems to be taking on board reasonable amount. But you do that as a bit of an eye and a guesswork. Looking at the hormonal tracking, though, what's been fascinating is, yes, she's having a menstrual cycle, she's having a bleed, but it was showing her estrogen was actually really erratic and her progesterone is flatlined. So therefore, she's not actually having a normal menstrual cycle. It means that she's having a and ovulatory. She's not releasing an egg every month. And that's really detrimental to her long-term health. And that's also recognizing that that's a fertility risk in the future. Now, it's mid-20-year-old, that might not be on the, an interest or concern right now, but we're not doing our due diligence or duty of care if we don't recognize that long-term health implication and do something about it. And so the stuff that's out there now, and recognizing, being able to track hormones and their cycle and the impact that we have if we do an intervention, I think is crucial. And I think what we're doing now with this particular athlete with the nutritional side of things is much closer with the energy in, energy expenditure monitoring, and making sure that's up to scratch. Because when we then analysed it and looked into it, this athlete was still like 1,000 calories down on some key days, which obviously is just it's not good enough. So, but getting her psychology on board with how to fuel more, I mean, that's the other bigger part of the puzzle, isn't it? With sort of a history like that. But anyway, I'm ranting, sorry. But yeah, the female athlete health space fascinates me because I think there's so much to it. There is the hormones, there's the pelvic floor, but there's also small things that, Emma and the Well HQ would talk about, of little things like a sports bra can save you a mile on a marathon, so can take time off, but yet we focus on wearing like the Nike, what are they called, the Nike Fly trainers and stuff, thinking that we're going to cut 4 seconds off our time, when actually we could sort of, cut serious time off if a female wore the right sports bra, which is nuts.
It is nuts. And fascinating. I won't go down how a sports bra might help me in my latter age to shave some time off my mile times. But
give it a go, mate. See how you go.
Yeah, I'll send you a photo. I'll post it to the Informed Performance group, I'm sure, at some point in the future. Maybe in sort of some sort of charitable donation event. But no, there's some fascinating insights for people working with female athletes there, and certainly it's something very new to me. I want to go a little bit back to kind of this journey and where we started, and sort of give you a chance now to think about the broader picture. We just talked about how, like, the kind of holistic approach, if you like, around a female athlete example. What are you taking, and what have you taken really from your journey, the world outside of sport, certainly outside the world of kind of conventional sport, and how that can complement what you're doing right now?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, I think coming from a world that's in sport, we feel like that is the world. I don't know, or that certainly was the impression I got when I was very much in it. And I've loved stepping out of it from a point of view of it opening my eyes to a number of different things that are going on, that are out there, that the world's a lot bigger than the world of sport. And yet certainly in, say, for instance, World Extreme Medicine, which sort of I'm fortunate to be faculty of, and the people that I work with there are, just amazing. And you the stories that go on from humanitarian relief work, the extreme medicine stuff, from whether it's the heli medicine, to all the different stuff that we were doing, polar versus jungle, all the different environments. There's so much that can be, I think, that in those environments where we're really restricted to and very remote in how we deliver care, can really sort of help some of the foundational basics, I think, in how we operate in a sport context, and vice versa. What we know in sport to be a good way to optimize performance can help the extreme medicine world. But I mean, to give you an example of that as well, I think there were things that I took from now working in the extreme medicine stuff from a humanitarian point of view. You go to the third world countries, for instance, and this is a bit abstract, but third world countries, and you've got massive loss of life numbers due to DMV and cholera, because people just aren't able to manage themselves well, and obviously the water quality and those sorts of things. But if people knew how to self-manage themselves well, that'd be great. Now, part of the problem was they can't get to the nearest sort of doc, relief support, and they ended up, they've put programs in place which now are like, even just instead of raising the money to build, say, a hospital, they've put small amount of finance and a lot less cost to get some education and awareness out, so that people can actually, again, take empowerment, so take self-direction themselves in how to manage and not be reliant on others, which I think is great to see. And they're doing that on a mass scale. Also, just what they do in humanitarian work with the ability to sort of pop up medical units and full surgical procedures in extremely horrendous environments is unbelievable. And then, from that, working with, I'm on the lifeboat down here in Cornwall, and that, again, stripping it back to the basics of pure survival, that's really helped kind of doing the lifeboat stuff. I brought that into working with sailing, because it was that there was such a, we focus so much on the performance, but actually, we want to maximize availability. And for instance, to be the close contact, I'd say, is that from doing the lifeboat work and seeing how we do casualty care out on the water, and it's a really simplified process that the RNLI teach us, and it doesn't matter what your background, you don't need to be medical. One of the strategies I did with sailing was bringing in a trauma strategy, was completely rewriting a new first aid sort of awareness stuff for the coaches and the athletes, because basically I'm the physio in the dock, we're not there on the water with them, and these boats now are becoming foiling, and there's high risk of catastrophic bleed, significant head injuries, entrapment, all of these things, which are what we see on the lifeboat. And so I wanted to make sure the coach and the athletes have a process in place, know how to operate, and can be independent with that, so that they've got the right kit on the ribs with the coaches. They've got a method of communication, and everybody knows what they're doing, and they feel then the confidence, if they've got that stuff and they're competent in those skills, suddenly they've got the confidence to push the boundaries of performance. Because what we were finding is, when I started asking and talking to the athletes and coaches about this, was that, they were actually, we had some athletes that were scared of falling in the water, and they're sailors. And if they're scared of falling in the water, they're not going to stick the boat on the edge. And if they're not sticking the boat on the edge, they're not pushing that boundary of performance. So, with sort of the help of Paul Mullin in sort of how to shape this strategy and not make them scared of trauma, and make them sort of like, oh my God, I don't want to fall in the water because I might have a catastrophic bleed. It was the other way round, of trying to frame it to sort of say, actually, if we can get you confident in the water, and sort of, getting them to do safety drills, and getting them to do swimming pool drills of holding their breath and going underwater and swimming under the boat, all that sort of stuff was all part of the strategy to build their confidence, so that they could push boundaries of performance. And that only came about because of the work I'd done outside of elite sport, working with extreme medicine and being on the lifeboat. And so that's one example of where I've felt the outer world has helped me bring it back into sport, and vice versa. I would say doing the stuff that I've done in corporate has definitely helped, from the world of learning performance in a sport context to now understanding, what people need to deliver on a critical performance goal in a corporate environment. Obviously is very different, but at the same time it's cognitive performance, and they need to sustain a high level of pressure and performance output on a regular basis. But therefore what we focus on in a corporate space might be more mindset and kind of sustainable cognitive load management, which again is also can be useful for those sports that are very cognitive load heavy.
I'm sort of, you lost me there, because I was just thinking about loads of things based on our conversation. Not lost me. I think it's just very thought provoking. The way you kind of think. I can imagine
I was going to say that I can imagine it is a bit losing. I mean, I do get the fact that sort of what we're talking about here is very abstract. It's very out of, what I'm doing. And I would say the environment I most probably struggle the most to articulate kind of the areas that I'm working in right now, and is, in sport, I think we're really used to a very simple, your job role. If I say I'm a physio for British Sailing, you can be pigeonholed, right? Like, that's easy. We know what that role means, what responsibility I'd have, what level I'm working at. And kind of what we're talking about here, like, yeah, I've gone more portfolio. There's differences, and people will struggle to sort of see the link and the why and what that means. But fundamentally, it strips back to the fact that, for me personally, what I get a kick out of, what I enjoy, is just putting the human at the centre. And whether that human is an elite sports person, is somebody that's wanted to break a world record, or is somebody in a high-end C-suite sort of, leadership role in a corporate environment, I just want to get the best out of any individual team that I work with, and will draw on as many worlds as possible to bring that to the party. And if that's from, testing in the military environment versus it being the extreme medicine stuff, I think all of our worlds have something to offer to each other that could help us all perform better.
Yeah, what a summary. I think when I say you lost me, it's because I was staring into this nice view I've got outside of my window, thinking about some of the lessons I've learned from this conversation, essentially. And, it's always nice to talk to people who've got a diverse view of the world, look at things through a different lens. And hopefully that's something that the listeners it will come across to you in the same way it's come across to me and resonated with me. So, Laura, look, thanks so much for giving up your time, and it's been a great conversation for me. Just to sort of, before we finish, it'd be really nice if the listeners could know where to find you. So where are you on sort of social channels, or where can the listeners look to find you?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for that, Ben. I'm on Instagram, Twitter, the usual, and just for under my name, so at Laura Penhall, which is spelled Penhaul. And website is the same, www.laurapenhall.com. But yeah, would love to chat. Always open to ideas and discussions, and just brainstorming and getting creative and collaborating with different people. So yeah, please do reach out and hopefully meet some of you soon.
And if, like me, you Google Laura, you'll find one of the top sort of hits is Laura Penhall actor, which comes from that Netflix documentary originally, and now I believe it's on Amazon, which we'll link to in the show notes. Losing Sight of Shore. So, as you say, portfolio physio, world record holder and actress is a pretty decent way of summing up this pod.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you, mate. But actress, I'm not sure anybody would take me up on my acting skills, but yeah, if you do watch Losing Sight of Shore, it's pretty raw. So yeah, that definitely gives you a very raw insight into me as a person, emotions and all. I'll give you that.
Fantastic. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Ben.
A big thanks to Laura for coming on and sharing her expertise, but also her fascinating and unique story. I hope you enjoyed today's Informed Performance podcast. If you'd like to receive updates, then give us a follow on social media. You can find us on Instagram at Informed Performance, or on Twitter at InformPod. You can also find today's show notes at our website, informedperformance.com. You've been listening to the Informed Performance podcast. Catch us next time for more performance and sports medicine insights.